This is a video record of our transatlantic cruise in 2015 on the Regal Princess. This is the part 2 video. In this part we traveled to Glasgow, Scotland, Belfast, Northern Ireland, and Cove, Ireland. To recap, at the end of the part 1 video we had left Bergen, Norway bound for Glasgow, Scotland. Just after leaving Bergen, the captain had informed the passengers that the ship was having engine problems. Despite the problems with the engine, we sailed all night. During the night, they fixed the engine problems and we arrived on time in Scotland the next morning, September 15th.
Here we are the morning of Glasgow, Scotland.
We did not dock in Glasgow. The city of Glasgow is not accessible by large cruise ships, so we had to dock here at Greenock, which is about 25 miles west of Glasgow. After breakfast, we left the ship and boarded an excursion bus which drove us to the center of Glasgow. In this excursion, the bus would drop us all off in the middle of Glasgow, pick us up again at the end of the day, and then return us to the ship. As we got closer to Glasgow, we saw definite signs of civilization. They dropped us off at George Square in the middle of Glasgow. The square was named after King George III, who was the British king leading up to, during, and after the American Revolution. Up this street is where they dropped us off. That's our bus, the first white one.
Okay, we're still in George Square.
This is a statue of Prince Albert in George Square. Albert was the husband of Queen Victoria of England in the early 1800s. Yes, that's a traffic cone on his head. We found out that this is a kind of initiation ritual for local college students to climb the statue, place the cone on the prince's head, and make his or her escape before being caught. We walked from George Square to Glasgow Cathedral, which was completed in 1136, almost 400 years before the Reformation, and it is the only Scottish cathedral to have survived the Reformation intact. The cathedral has been in constant use for worship for over 800 years and marks the birthplace of the city of Glasgow. The interior of the cathedral was the most impressive of all the churches we saw on this trip. Next, we walked to Provence House, which was built in 1471 for the Bishop of Glasgow. Inside and out, this building really looks 600 years old. As you can see, the people from the 1400s were measurably shorter than the people of today. The house was filled with items from that era, including this table, which looked quite modern. After Provence House, we walked through George Square again on our way to Buchanan Street, the city's main pedestrian boulevard. As we walked down Buchanan Street, we saw this Apple store in a building which reminded us of the McDonald's we had seen in Christensen. We were told that this kilt maker was the most famous in all of Scotland. Buchanan Street was a shopper's paradise. Its crown jewel store is called the House of Fraser. It is comparable to London's Harrods department store and to New York's Macy's department store. Next is a better shot to show the size of Fraser's. As you would imagine, the inside was quite spectacular. We continued down Buchanan Street, which ended at the Cafe Nero, which used to be the old transport ticket office. Next to Cafe Nero was an indoor shopping mall called St. Enoch Square. We walked through the mall, in which Robin found another Disney store. Life is good. By now it was almost time to meet our bus for the trip back to the ship, so we started walking back to George Square. On the way, we passed this bakery. Everything looked so good that we went in and bought treats, which we ate before continuing on our walk. We arrived in George Square a little early, so I had an opportunity to sneak a peek inside the Glasgow City Hall, which was very impressive. That night we set sail for our next stop, Belfast, Ireland. We arrived early in the morning and the weather was shaping up to be absolutely beautiful. We docked in Belfast Harbour, which was the place they built the Titanic. The circled area is the dry dock where they built that doomed ship. The next circled area shows the museum they recently built to house artifacts from the Titanic. And this circled area shows where the Regal docked. After breakfast, we left the ship and boarded the bus that would take us on the day-long excursion we had booked. Unfortunately, the excursion did not stop in Belfast itself, so we were not able to see any of the city or any of the Titanic sites. Very soon after we started on the drive, we encountered fog that made us worried about the weather at our destinations. We left Belfast and drove about 90 minutes to our first destination, Dunlucy Castle on the rocky Antrim coast. Luckily, by the time we reached the castle, the fog gave way to bright sunshine. Dunluce Castle dates from the 1500s. Legend has it that the kitchen part of the castle fell into the sea one stormy night in 1639 and killed all the residents and guests of the castle except for a young kitchen helper. After Dunluce Castle, we drove to our next destination, the Giant's Causeway. The causeway, which means bridge, is an area covered with about 40,000 interlocking volcanic hexagon columns. The causeway is considered the eighth wonder of the world and is the only UNESCO World Heritage Site in Northern Ireland. According to legend, an Irish giant named Finn McCool was challenged to a fight by the Scottish giant named Benandonner. The story goes that the columns are the remains of a causeway built by Finn McCool across the North Channel to have this fight. In the story, Finn has second thoughts about the fight when he realizes the other giant is much bigger than he is. Finn's wife disguises him as a baby and tucks him in a cradle. When Benandonner sees the size of the quote-unquote baby, he thinks that its father Finn must be a giant among giants. Benandonner flees back to Scotland in fright, destroying the causeway behind him so that Finn would be unable to chase him down. Before we left, I couldn't resist climbing this mound to pose as King of the Hill. After the Giant's Causeway, we got back in our bus and drove to the next stop on our excursion, the Carrick-a-Reedy Rope Bridge. The bridge links the mainland to the tiny island of Carrick-a-Reedy. The bridge is mainly a tourist attraction with some 480,000 visitors a year. We didn't have time to go down and cross the bridge, but I'm sure it would have been fun. We left the rope bridge and drove to our last stop, a lookout point near the small town of Ballycastle. From there, if you look beyond the island in the foreground, you can just make out the southern coast of Scotland. After we finished there, we drove through the town of Ballycastle but did not stop, so Robin had to take these pictures of it on the fly. We continued driving, and after another hour or so we arrived in Belfast. We made no stops in Belfast, so again, Robin had to take pictures from the bus. Here is the Belfast City Hall, and here are the twin cranes of the Harland and Wolff Shipbuilding Company. The cranes are called Samson and Goliath, and to give you an idea of their size, here is a picture of the Statue of Liberty superimposed over one of the cranes. The Harland and Wolff Company has been in business since 1868 and was the company that built, among other things, the Titanic. It only took a few minutes to drive from downtown Belfast to the Regal Princess. That night, we set sail for our last European port, Cork, Ireland. At about 9 o'clock that night, they held an automated water and light show on the main deck. I chose not to go because it was too cold and windy, but Robin went and shot these pictures. I think there was only one other person who braved the elements to watch the show that night. We left Belfast on the evening of September 16th. We cruised all night to our next destination, the city of Cork, Ireland. But as with Glasgow, Scotland, the Regal was unable to sail directly to Cork because the city lies at the end of a river that is too shallow for cruise ships to navigate. The closest port to Cork is a place called Cove, which is about 10 miles southeast of Cork. And no, there is no mistake, Cove is how the Irish say the name spelled C-O-B-H. By the way, Cove is the port from which the Titanic sailed on her maiden and last voyage across the Atlantic. We approached the Irish coast at around 6 o'clock, just in time to see the sunrise. It took the ship about an hour to sail up the channel to Cove. As we traversed the channel, we started to see homes and other elements of the Irish life. We sailed into Cove Harbor about 7 o'clock in the morning. The weather was absolutely beautiful, and the tranquil scene of Cove as she awoke was a marvel to behold. As we prepared to dock, we noticed this monument behind the dock. The monument was erected to recognize Cove as the last port of call for the Titanic. After we docked, we noticed that there was a train station right at the dock. Good to know for future trips. We were the most excited about this port because my research had shown that specific areas outside Cove would be the most picturesque of all the places we would see on the trip. I booked an excursion that would visit those places. Like Belfast, the excursion would not allow us to visit the primary cities of this stop, namely Cove and Cork. After breakfast, we boarded the bus that would take us on our excursion. Our first stop was the little town of Ballycastle, the birthplace of Henry Ford's ancestors, including his father. We never saw the town itself. Instead, we stopped for 10 minutes at this roadside tribute to Henry Ford. This Model T trimmed in silver paint, and the Henry Ford Tavern, which a lack of time prevented us from seeing. We reboarded the bus and drove to our next stop, the little town of Clonakilty, which dates back to the early 1300s. Known as Clon by locals, Clonakilty is also famous for being the home of the world's only Random Acts of Kindness Festival. The Irish Tourist Board has also designated Clonakilty a heritage town. After getting off the bus, we were led to this hotel where we were treated to a sumptuous lunch with all the trimmings. Unbelievably, this feast was included in the price of our excursion. All kidding aside, this was really a quaint town. One of the first things we saw was this statue of Michael Collins, who is most famous for his leadership of the Republican military campaign against Britain, aka the War of Independence, through the Irish Republican Army. Right after that, we saw the Church of the Immaculate Conception, which dates from 1880. The insides were very rich and opulent. Across the street from this church was this much older church that is now the Clonakilty Post Office. Just down the street was Spiller's Lane, which was like a short alley with shops and restaurants on either side. After that was the Jellyfish Surf Shop, an odd thing to see in this little town. Further down the street was the main drag of Clonakilty, with several bars, a hotel, and many shops. We walked by a hotel with this plaque outside. It seems during World War II an American bomber force landed near Clonakilty and the crew spent the night in this hotel. We wished that we had had more time to explore this fine example of a small Irish town, but soon it was time to board our bus and take off for our next destination, the little town of Glengariff. Glengariff is more a village than a town, boasting a population of 800 people. The entire town is 1 block long with a cemetery at the far end of it. It is one of those towns that fits the old joke, if you blink while driving through it, you'll miss it. Maureen O'Hara used to live very close to Glengariff and came into town regularly and frequently while she was alive. The townspeople were obviously proud of their town. Everything was well kept up and painted bright colors. The road that ran through the town was obviously a major thoroughfare, but the traffic was still very, very light. Here is the cemetery. It was interesting that many of the grave sites are filled with colored rock. We never figured out why. We grudgingly left Glengariff and started towards our next destination, Beara Lake, which is in the middle of Ireland's first national park. My research before the trip had shown us that Beara Lake would be the most picturesque of all the stops on the entire cruise. When we arrived at the lake, it was obvious that my research had been correct. The lake was smaller than we thought it would be, and the weather when we arrived was less than perfect, but it was still amazingly beautiful. On the edge of the lake is the Gorgain Bar Hotel, the building with a little bit of purple just to the right of center of this picture. Lunch was going to be provided at the hotel as part of the excursion, so after we got off the bus, we proceeded to the hotel dining room.
Oh yeah, there you are. Are we doing? We're just through in here.
We sat down at the first table we saw and ordered. The food was not that good, and we were anxious to go back outside, so we got up and left before anyone else did. Here's what we wanted to see: St. Finbarr's Oratory. The pictures of it we had seen on the internet showed the most serene and majestically beautiful place we could imagine. It was just about this time that the clouds started to part and we could see blue skies. Then the sun came out and we got our first view of the oratory in the sunlight. According to tradition, St. Finbarr, Cork's patron saint, built a monastery here in the 6th century. The monastery is long gone, but in its place is this tiny and picturesque oratory. There is a small earthen bridge connecting the hotel side with the oratory. We crossed it and saw this gate leading to the oratory. The oratory was even smaller up close than it was from a distance. Everything inside was in miniature. When we came back outside, we saw there was a rainbow seeming to emanate from the oratory. It was spectacular. Wishing we could have spent more time at Barra Lake, we reluctantly climbed aboard our bus and rode back to Cove. Before we got back on the ship, we looked around in the Cove Heritage Center next to the ship. Most of the exhibitions were about Irish history. There was also an exhibition on the history of the Titanic. Just outside the Heritage Center, there is a statue of a young girl and 2 boys. The statue represents 3 real people. The young girl is Annie Moore. She was the first immigrant to the United States to pass through the Ellis Island facility in New York Harbor. She left from Cove accompanied by her brothers Philip and Anthony aboard the steamship Nevada on January 1st, 1892, her 15th birthday. After passing through Ellis Island, all 3 Moore children were soon reunited with their parents who were already living in New York City. By the way, there is a corresponding statue of Annie Moore looking a little like Mary Poppins in the Immigration Museum on Ellis Island. And here is a picture of Annie Moore with her brothers. Sorry for the poor quality of the picture. That night we left Cove and started on the TransAtlantic segment of our cruise. This would take us 4 days, but something happened not too long after we left Cove that threatened to alter the itinerary on the other side of the Atlantic.